So we're here this afternoon in Turcot Tower, near to Abingdon and Wallingford, with Christine McCulloch. And Christine was heavily involved in some of the early setting up of hydrological research in the UK and the expansion of hydrological research in the UK. But perhaps you could start by giving us a little bit of background in terms of how your early career developed. And you originally had a geography degree, I believe.
Yes, I started off as a geographer and as a geomorphologist, and after getting a Fulbright scholarship to go to the Oberlin College, Ohio, I was offered a job at Goldsmiths, teaching geomorphology and surveying and geography of North America and many things to introduce to what had been solely a teacher training college, introduce an honours degree, University of London honours degree. And so that was very hard work. But after 3 years, I went to Queen Mary College as a lecturer. And then 2 years later, I saw an advert for the Natural Environment Research Council. This was a very new thing. People didn't talk about the environment in those days, but this seemed very exciting because we'd had publications coming out showing how the harm that people were doing to the environment. Rachel Carson's book had come out, and I was very excited by the idea that here was putting environmental science into practice. So I applied for a job there and was given a job as a senior scientific officer, which is middle management, and covering physical geography, geomorphology, hydrology, meteorology, and the Antarctic, and land use was my
land use.
was my remit.
So this would be 1965 when
NOCAD started in 1965. But
okay.
What they'd done was they had very few staff, and what they'd done, they'd taken them from the Nature Conservancy, and they had a small team from the Nature Conservancy. That's the establishment officer, and Frank Green as a SPSO, and Ray Beverton was brought in from the Ministry of Agriculture's Fisheries Research Laboratory, where he'd done studies on fish populations in the North Sea, and so he was the head of our office in Alhambra House in Charing Cross Road in London, and there were about I think there were 12 of us in the science division, and a man called McLean, we called him Mac. Mac had been a hydrologist. This is very fortunate. He'd been a hydrologist, physicist working in the Road Research Laboratory, and he'd been brought in to this new organisation to work under Beverton, but as the director of scientific research. So I reported to him and to Frank Green, who was again he'd done hydrology in the Nature Conservancy and climatology. He was a very inventive geographer who pioneered lots of things. He didn't follow them through, but the important thing was that he had done some hydrological research, and he was interested in climatology for the whole of the Nature Conservancy, their nature reserves. So there were two people there in the scientific team, a small scientific team, who knew or had some idea of hydrology and its importance. The Natural Environment Research Council had a sort of existential problem to start off with, because what was its identity? Part of its identity was because of the growing interest in the environment internationally, particularly in America, and the development of programs such as the International Hydrological Decade. And the UK really didn't have very much to contribute. I mean, and people realise that a lot of our environmental sciences weren't very well developed at all, and it was felt that the Science Research Council gave such prominence to physicists and chemists and laboratory studies that they would continue to neglect ecology and rather less precise or forms of science, that they would regard it as stamp collecting and just collection of data for its own sake, and no atheoretical.
What we would now call the inexact sciences.
Inexact sciences. So, in a way, this rather persecuted group of people, the ecologists, underfunded, and was suddenly, by the Harold Wilson government, I don't know quite how it came about. I think it's because the Nature Conservancy was already in existence, and they didn't know, the Scientific Research Council didn't want to have the Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy, the oceanographers, National Institute of Oceanography, the British Antarctic Survey, and the British Geological Survey, it was then, were brought together as research institutes to be governed. You can imagine how they loved that idea when they'd been independent, and and they were supposed to now report to Beven about their work. I remember him saying he wanted to be the head of the cricket team, and you can see them all as players. You see the directors as players. He was going to be the head of the cricket team, but they were very, very obstreperous, and there were huge rows with Duncan Poor, who was the head of the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy were extraordinarily clever because they had so many people in the House of Lords that they cultivated who were interested in the Nature Conservancy, that he used to try to bypass all the machinations and go and appeal to people at higher levels, you see, and have Lords so-and-so breathing down the neck of poor Ray Bevan. Anyway, that was a very interesting time.
But from a hydrological point of view, of course, when NERC was set up, that was the time when the Hydrology Research Unit at Wallingford became the Institute of Hydrology.
That had been founded in '62, and then it was there as a kind of hopeful kernel that it was going to be expanded. It was very small.
Oh yes, when I visited in the 70s, it was only a one floor of offices.
5 scientists, I think. John Sutcliffe, John Rodder.
Robin Clark was
came a bit later.
Yes.
I think the Shaw was there, and I mean there were only very few. And so you can imagine this little tiddler trying to compete for these government funding. We're competing against the British Geological Survey, a huge organisation, been there since the 19th century. British Antarctic Survey, run by Sir Vivian Fuchs and supported by the Foreign Office. You couldn't cut that down in any way. And then the Nature Conservancy with all their influence and so on, and the oceanography with their great big ships and so on. And there was little hydrology trying to get money and trying to be something at all. So the opposition was quite amazing. Some of my notes of some of the early meetings,
everybody wants to put them down.
A chap from ODA, in fact, said, "Well, we've got no need for any hydrology." when later, of course, ODA was one of the biggest
contractors of
anyway, it was quite an interesting time. It was very fortunate that in the headquarters that there were these two people who supported it, knew it, and saw opportunities, and managed to not only cultivate this little science, but actually build it a separate building and put in capital and build up a research station. I mean, that was quite amazing, because it could have just been a little group in the university. And there we are. So I that's what I went into. as a geographer. It was very interesting.
So around that time, when you were dealing with hydrology and the other areas within Jim McCulloch was director of the Institute of Hydrology. So did you meet through the committee structure of NERC, shall we say?
Yes. He was the head of the small unit, but then the big thing was the decision to give an entire building and major funding to this small unit. And so Jim had an awful lot to do with the design of the actual building. And because the headquarters was so small in that time, there was no people in the establishment who could deal with all the contracts and the talks with the architects and buying the land. And so, in a rather strange way, a scientist was asked to do a lot of administrative management of the whole building,
right,
to talk to the architects and do the design. And so there was a lot of correspondence between Jim and the headquarters, and it was very important at that time that he was given a huge amount of responsibility. And I think, in a way, this was detrimental to his science, because he couldn't develop his own research to the same extent as perhaps the established directors who'd they'd inherited a going concern. He had to build the concern from nothing, and because the headquarters, there were so few people, if he hadn't done it, there wouldn't have been anybody doing it. So it was very important at that time, and he was lucky in a way that he'd had a lot of responsibility when he'd been in the RAF. He was a lieutenant, and he had about 50 men to control and organise. So he unusually perhaps for a scientist, he said when he was at Rothamsted, as a scientist, he'd spent 3 years looking down a hole in the soil, and which didn't give him the organisational ability that he got in the RAF. And then, of course, he'd had experience in Africa organising catchment studies, which in Africa the opportunities were amazing, because you could change the land use, and in a few years' time the vegetation had changed and grown back again. And he had a large number of Kenyan staff who would run up ladders on top of the trees, and they. Can I tell a story about Jim organising the catchments?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Since we haven't had the opportunity to interview Jim,
he went from doing a PhD at Rothamsted into what was. He was a ranked officer in the RAF, but he was in atomic weapons, and he had to organise field trials of transporting atom bombs around the country, and how they would disperse them in need of invasion. And he also had to do things with the design of the fuses in atom bombs. But he decided he didn't want to spend his life doing atom bombs, because he wanted to fulfill his ambition for what he'd always wanted to do, which was to improve agriculture. He came from a very small farm in the north of Scotland, and that was his motivation. So he, after doing this, his national service, you had to do something for national service for 2 or 3 years at that time. So he chose to do it as an officer, applying his physics in atomic weapons rather than doing square bashing, perhaps at a very different line of work. But then he decided he'd go and join the colonial service and go out to Kenya, where there were opportunities to do agricultural meteorology or hydrology outside Nairobi, where there was a research station where they were studying tropical diseases and hydrology and meteorology, because the British government spent more money on supporting hydrology overseas than they did at home, because they'd had a disastrous time with the groundnut scheme. The groundnut scheme was after the war, when it seemed to fulfill the need for Britain to have more food, more oil. They were going to have it from groundnuts. They were going to plant them all over huge areas in Tanzania, and they without very little research, they tried to use European ploughs on very hard laterite soils, and they had one disaster, disease after another, and the whole thing was a complete waste of money and rubbish. That was the groundnut scheme. And so after that, the government put in a lot of money into control of the tsetse fly. That was a great success at the research station. They made wonderful strides in the biological and veterinary side. And under somebody called Charles Pereira, they made big strides in hydrology, in studying the relationship between the vegetation in the upper catchments, where the rain in Kenya was largely confined to the uplands. If you didn't get the water relations right in the upper catchments where the rainfall was, there would be even less water for the irrigation and all the people who depended on the rivers downstream. So it was very important few years of catchment studies, and Jim did work there on catchments and looking at the influence of shade trees and the tea plantations, and whether you should have grass or the influence of cutting down the forests on the water relations. So there's enormous opportunities, plenty of staffing, and quite a lovely time for developing a subject, because you have the opportunity. Now, one of the things was Jim found that he was interested in applying Penman's equation and trying to modify it for high altitudes where they were in Kenya, and he needed to get regular readings of radiation, solar radiation. But he found that the African helpers came and they wouldn't come on time. He had to have the reading done at 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, some of them rolled up at 9:30 or 10, or the other day they'd come at 7:30, and so on. And he got rather, he kept saying, it's very important that you come and do the reading at the exact time every day, because otherwise I won't be able to use the data. But then he found that the reason was that nobody had a watch, nobody had a clock, and so they just guessed the time to come and do the reading. And so Jim thought, what's he going to do? So he made himself into a wholesale dealer in watches. And he
sounds like Jim.
he got in touch with a Swiss firm, and he imported a lot of watches. And I've got the receipt books, and he sold them. He said he wasn't going to give them away because nobody would value them. And he sold them at wholesale prices to the African helpers, and so they got, as a mark of their job, they had a watch. And many years later, after Jim had been back here, almost 10 years, he took me out to Kenya with our son, and we were coming along in Maguga, where this station had been, and there was this African by the road selling ornaments, and he suddenly started waving at us, and so Jim stopped the car, and he'd been one of these laboratory assistants, and he went, "It's still going, my watch is still going."
Oh, wonderful.
And he said, "Oh, you've got a son," and he gave us a carved rhinoceros. So that was quite a nice reminder that these watches had been valued, and they enabled them to become, do everything at the right time. But Jim was very inventive like that, and he is very imaginative in how people who work for him felt about their jobs and how to organise them. And he always used to say it was because he'd studied psychology at Edinburgh alongside his physics that he made him to realise how to, rather than just saying condemning people for not coming on time, but trying to find out why they didn't come and give them an incentive.
Yes, although he did have a stress management technique in terms of managing some of his staff as well.
Yes, I know.
and in his relations to NERC as well.
Yes, of course, yes. But we were talking about the early days,
yes,
when the building had to be built, and there was a lot of, and then the catchments had to be found where they were going to do the experiments, and there were all kinds of troubles with they got so far with going to have one, where was it, Keith? John Rodder and
Longmend.
They were going to have that, and then the last minute the landlord wouldn't agree, and then they had to find, and they found people a man in Plinlimmon who agreed to it all. But you can imagine at that time Jim must have been sitting on about 8 different committees: the IHD committee, the instrument committee, the hydrology committee, the hydrology research grants committee, and he had all these negotiations to do with the architects, with the people on the catchment studies. He had to do the IHD work and go to Switzerland. And his entire timetable was involved in trying to keep all these people happy.
Yeah.
And he used to, you see, and in the early days, you had to recruit everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes,
that took...
Expansion was quite quick.
Expansion, that was the most amazing thing about the Institute, because all these young men and 1 or 2 women, the young women, they all came, all eager beavers from different disciplines, and they were suddenly doing this subject they hadn't perhaps done a great deal of before, and having to work in interdisciplinary teams. And, the engineers would look down upon the scientists as being airy-fairy, and the physicists would look down upon the geographers as being inexact and incapable of of doing anything properly. And there were all these tensions, and they had to be built into teams, and that was a difficulty. But on the other hand, they were young and enthusiastic, and the opportunities seemed to be endless. So it was a very good, I think, very good spirit in the Institute at that time. It was quite a jolly place, really.
I joined in 1977.
Oh, quite a long while. It's 10 years after.
I was an example of that because the post that was advertised was for a mathematical modeller.
Yes.
And they interviewed 5 mathematicians and me
with
a geography degree.
Oh, I say, well, you did do well.
I did learn later that the discussions on the appointing committee were somewhat heated.
Yes.
As to who they should appoint. But in the end, they went for me. So,
that was excellent.
But no, it was a good. I can vouch for the fact that it was a very good place to work at the time.
And
people were very friendly, and we
That's right.
had social events as well as work meetings and so on and so forth.
That's right. Yes, and lots of parties and
at that time, did Jim still have relatively good support within NERC? Because
yes.
Later it got a bit
well,
fraught.
you see, you can imagine in the early days, he worked very closely with McLean and getting the money to get this, scheduling the money, and because in government you've got to spend the money in the relevant year, otherwise you lose it, and all the getting all that worked out and so on. He had very close relationships with Miss Ferry, the finance officer, and McLean and Frank Green, and that went very well. The difficulties later on is, as you can imagine, if you've been responsible for everything, and then suddenly the headquarters were more distant. They'd gone to Swindon, and they'd had a huge amount of personnel developed. So you couldn't even run your own cars yourself. Jim had Land Rovers for going up to the catchments, and he'd got a transport manager, and they had a relationship with a local garage who would always mend the vehicles and so on. And then suddenly the headquarters then had centralised, and they all had to have the same vehicles, and they all had to do this. And if you said, well, I wanted this kind of vehicle to carry this equipment, you had to make a case, and you had to go through all these different people. And that was a big bone of contention.
Bureaucratic.
And at the beginning, he had the big computer, the IBM was at Wallingford. And then they wanted to take it away, and that was a big battle. That was huge. I mean, these battles now seem ridiculous because computing is everybody's got it on their desk. But at that time, it was a big thing.
A big thing, yeah.
And he had to arrange for it to be used during the night by the RAF at Benson, and to justify it. But you see, the other directors, they wanted it taken away and used by. Anyway, there were all kinds of things like this. When if you've been running your own ship, and then suddenly all these other people who knew nothing about it, in his view, from the headquarters wanted to standardise and get in the way. No more quick decisions could be made, you see, and so this used to annoy him immensely.
I remember being in his office once or twice when he was taking telephone calls with no headquarters.
Really? Oh, I think Roger Moore has stories about them when in the Ordnance Survey, because Jim was very annoyed with the Ordnance Survey because the flood studies people wanted to have accurate maps in order to do a flood mapping, you see, and the Ordnance Survey had hardly done any digitisation of their maps, and there was that time, and they were so slow. And anyway, Roger has a very funny story about when they went down to the Ordnance Survey, and Jim was very angry with the people, and he apparently, this is what Roger said. Jim said, "And you're going to have to pay for lunch, you know, because they've gone back and they've been at an unsatisfactory meeting because they weren't doing." They weren't producing. Well, nowadays they would do, but I mean, in those days they were rather behind the times and set in their ways. But anyway, that was.
It was going back just a little bit. There was also an issue after the Rothschild report in 1971.
Yes, Jim wrote quite a nice paper about that, because hydrology had been being done in a very minor way in a lot of organisations before it was before the Institute of Hydrology became a separate entity, but always been an underdog. They weren't able to do what Institute of Hydrology did, which was to develop it as a science in its own right, and they were always doing things, just measuring things and doing it just purely empirically and not really understanding why things were happening, but just doing what was thought by the engineers to be needed to just measure. Well, they could only measure discharge and rainfall really in the early days, but that was taken as being adequate. Anyway, always working for other organisations was a damper on the scientific spirit. And so when the Rothschild report came out, there was one little paragraph at the end which said the Institute of Hydrology should be transferred to was it Department of Environment?
Probably the Department
I think it was the Department of Environment, it was called at that time. And really, this was such a blow to think that they were then going to only be able to do the sort of hydrology that other people thought ought to be done, rather than being able to continue to be pioneering and and keeping it up with as an international science. And so Jim wrote a quite nice article there defending hydrology, and I don't quite know exactly how the battle was won, but there must have been people behind the scenes. There must have been a lot of behind the scenes. It came out, and they were allowed to continue within the Natural Environment Research Council, because if they'd been put into a ministry, you see, they would have been very utilitarian. You wouldn't have been able to do anything until its usefulness was evident. So you couldn't suddenly think, I'm going to measure what happens in a stomata of a plant or something like that, because it would be too distant from the immediate needs. So he saw that as being anyway, that battle was won. That was about 1971, I think.
And having said that, I mean, the Institute did achieve quite a nice balance between science research and applied.
Oh, that was another thing about Jim. He was very open. He was very pleased when the universities developed. You could have said he wanted to. There was a bit of tension in that the scientists who collected all the data, did all the hard work collecting the data, weren't very pleased when some PhD student wanted to run off with all their data and publish the results before they'd had time to analyse it all themselves. But on the whole, Jim was very keen that the universities developed hydrology, and so he maintained good relationships with Novak in Newcastle and Rushton in Birmingham and Terence O'Donnell at Imperial, and Eamon Nash, of course, was a very good friend in Galway. And he was very open to applied research as well for the engineering firms, because that opened up opportunities, brought money in, and it gave people very good experience in a large number of different environments in Botswana, Oman, and various places. And he also kept the catchment studies in Kenya going. So he tried to help people to have a varied career, in that people wouldn't just be stuck doing the applied research all the time, but they could get an opportunity to develop their own research and then go and do some consultancy work and come back again. And so that was very good, because it ended up with the Institute of Hydrology earning more money than any of the other research stations proportionately. But it was also one of the reasons why hydrogeology didn't come formally into the Institute of Hydrology, though eventually the hydrogeologists worked on the same site. They were not separated in distance, because hydrogeology was one of the main money-making things for the EGS, and they didn't want to see that going, because that was it was very difficult to, as government was saying with the Rothschild report and so on, that things had to be useful, they had to bring money in, they had to be client-driven. It was much easier to stand against that if you were doing a certain proportion of that and you were bringing money in. It gave your science, you could protect your more pure or more experimental science behind this usefulness, or which is shown by consulting engineers and the engineering firms wanting the research. So managed to do both. That was an important thing.
And produce very useful things like the flood studies report and the flood estimation handbook, and and all the instrumentation developments.
That's what Jim's own most strong interest was. It was in measurement and getting improving rain gauges, John Rodder's work and Ian Strangeway's work, and
Jim
the neutron probe, and so because he believed that you couldn't have proper science without measurement. He always quoted Lord Kelvin. If you couldn't measure something, you couldn't describe it. So that was, Jim thought that was very important.
Yeah, that's something he should have been proud of, I think, because we still need more of that, actually, in terms of in hydrology.
Well, yes, that's what people worry about.
Measurement techniques. That,
people get so far away with modelling, they forget that it's based on some measurements, which, because you have to multiply the results up, the few measurements you've got to multiply them up, you're multiplying up the mistakes as well.
Absolutely,
you know. Yes. So
modellers are very good at that.
So that was what he. I mean, if he'd developed his own science more, he would have gone into that. I think.
When did Jim retire from the institute?
Well, that was it. Very annoying. I mean, you had to go at 60. I'd retired. All the civil service had to go at 60. But they said if they wanted to get rid of him earlier, there was some terrible row, and he didn't get on with, who was it at the time? Oh, I can't remember the name of the head of NERC. I could look it up. I can't remember. But there was some terrible rows, and they didn't like Jim because he'd been rude to them. You see, Robin Clark told me that Jim should have been given a knighthood, you see, but Robin had written, because Sir Malcolm Brown, Sir Vivian Fuchs, they all got knighthoods. And so Robin wrote to, I think it was Derek Gyps or somebody in the headquarters, and said, why hadn't Jim been considered for anything since he'd founded this and developed it all, And so they said he'd annoyed too many people in the headquarters, because you see the headquarters put in every year who they wanted to get a knighthood. Yeah. So anyway, that was the downside of the arguments. But the good side of the arguments was that he managed to protect his institute, and that continued to develop, but to his own detriment. So when he was 59, they said, because the institute had done so well getting overseas investments, overseas contracts, he ought to be able to do this for all the research institutes in Dirk, and they'd make him an international commissioner, and he would go out into the world and he'd get all these commissions in for the geologists and for the ecologists and so on. And so he had to go around the world, and he worked very hard at this, and he got contracts in, and then he found that people at this end didn't want to do them. So it was just such a ridiculous thing, because this post had been not thought through, because if you were the geologists didn't want to be bothered to do these overseas work. And so he'd get something all set up, and then it wouldn't go anywhere. And how could you go out and be an ambassador for people who hadn't got a trail? They should have had somebody as a kind of minor ambassador in each of the research centres who would feed up stuff to Jim, and he'd feed it down to them, and they would get it done in the organisation. But it hadn't been set up properly. So although he went around the world and went to all sorts of godforsaken places, he'd worked very hard at it, but it didn't go anywhere.
So then he retired.
He retired, but he didn't retire, because he became one of the 4 editors of the Journal of Hydrology. And so people came.
For a long while,
he did that and then he set up a new journal. He was the first editor of the Hydrology and Earth System Sciences. And gave up the Journal of Hydrology and did that one instead. And so he kept contact with all the same scientists, and they brought him papers, and he spent a lot of time editing them. And he particularly spent time with foreign speakers. and to get their scripts up to good standard of English. He was more of a conscientious editor than perhaps he should have been, but he enjoyed doing that, and so he had his influence there. And he also did jobs for the United Nations Development Programme. He went out to the most places that nobody else wanted to go to. He went to Myanmar when it was under very difficult conditions. He went to Mozambique, and he went somewhere else, I can't remember, but and did reports for the United Nations Development Programme. Oh yes, he went to the Yemen. They were all extremely difficult places. Yes. He also went to China and did a consultancy about hydrological research in China, and he found that none of the Chinese wanted to share their data with any other Chinese, so they had recordings, but they all kept them very secret. So his report was to try to open that out, because if you've got rather few rain gauge readings, it's no point of keeping them all to yourself.
No. Things have expanded a little in China since.
But, he had a very active retirement. In fact, he never wanted to give up, really.
Well, I think we've covered Jim's career.
Yes.
You told me earlier that you went back to the research councils.
Yes.
After bringing up your family.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, it was very fortunate the Economic and Social Research Council, along with the other research councils, moved to Swindon out of London. And 80% of the staff refused to go. And so, unusually, they advertised for senior scientific officers, and I'd been that 16 years beforehand in the Natural Environment Research Council. But because I was a geographer, I managed to persuade them I could also understand human geography. And so I got a job there at the ESRC and enjoyed it immensely. And I was there for 11 years. And then as soon as I retired, I enrolled at Oxford to do a doctorate. And I thought I'd do something watery so that Jim and I could go to conferences together and so on. And so I did work on the political ecology of reservoir construction in the UK. And that was very interesting. And we went to conferences in China and went down the Yangtze and were shown around the Three Gorges dam whilst it was in construction. Had lots of opportunity then to interview. I was interviewing dam engineers to understand why their attitude to rivers was different from the ecologists, because there was a big fight then between dam builders and ecologists who wanting the rivers to be natural. And so we went on this barge down the Yangtze, and Jim said that was a wonderful opportunity because I could interview very senior dam engineers. Because their only alternative would be to jump off jump off the boat into the Yangtze. They couldn't escape. And so that worked out very well. And then I've stayed in Oxford ever since. So I came to Oxford in 1999, and I'm still there doing a little bit of teaching at the age of 78. So that's worked out very well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating interview, and it's been nice to hear some stories about Jim as well as about your own career. Well, and Jim was it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Keith.
Well, thank you.